his YouTube. The brother is you missed a lot. I'm just going to run over his credentials again. He's born in New York. Among other things, he is a native of Queens, and he's a motivational speaker, an upcoming lecturer. He's a spiritual guide. Brother Mind Ascension, what else you
Health advisor.
Yes.
I do practice divination as well. Okay. I don't like to use certain terms because unfortunately many terms, even though that they are very well related to us and we're familiar with them, as I started the beginning of introducing myself, remember I said that we need to redefine a lot of things for ourselves. Mm-hmm. We need to create our own definition in order to change the energy of the words and terms that we use for ourselves. So certain terms and words I will not use to describe certain things that I do, but yes, that's basically it. I've been an advisor for very somewhat of a long time now, almost about 10 years now, dealing with health. Who I consider my personal teacher when it comes to health is Dr. Laila Africa. I have many so-called personal teachers that I've spent time with. Dr. Delbert Blair, he's a part of our ancestors right now. Dr. Phil Valentine. I'm also a part or affiliate of what's called WADU, World African Diaspora Union, who, excuse me, right now, all these names are going through the back of my mind. I want to give you Leonard Jeffries, who is one of the co-founders for WADU, who I have a personal affiliation with. He's still with us and looking great. And man, last time, I mean, this man is like, what, 88, 89, something like that. He's up there. And, you know, I met him maybe about 6 months ago. I met him numerous times, but the last time I saw him about 6 months ago, maybe a year now almost. And the man was full of fire, him and his wife. And, you know, I just love seeing our people in our eldership, but still within our youth, because one thing that we don't know is we're all guaranteed a minimum of 120 years within this physical vessel. So right. When we talk about 60 years old and 70 years old, I can't stand when I hear our Black women or our Black men refer to themselves as old when they hit 60 or 70 or even 80, because you're not old.
Right.
You're actually what they call it in your middle, what they call it, you're middle aged.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, you're actually middle aged. And you know, once we truly start adopting this mind frame, I can guarantee you it will prolong your life immediately. There are so many people, and this goes into my own personal ideology as well, but there are so many people that I've met in my life that because of their spirit alone, not their diet, they lived until their 90s and their 100s while still eating the crap that we judge today. You know, Dr. Ben Yakinen is one of them, lived to 96 years old. He was a big advocate for pork. Yeah. If anybody know, I got all his lectures. The man was always, he was always praising pork. Oh, and that man died at 96 years old. And unfortunately, I love to make correlations because I truly feel that the mind is always over the body. So when we put too much emphasis on the body instead of the mind, the next thing we know, the body becomes all there is, and it actually deteriorates faster and we age faster. Yes, and that's why we really should not even acknowledge time as anything real. It's merely an illusion because we live within cycles of expansion, moments, and experiences, not counting day to day to month to year until our death.
Right. Now, so, I have a question, but I have a question of my own, Brother Mind Ascension. So when my question to you is, you are definitely sure that there is nothing in African perspective when it comes to our African history of Black men, African men, related to them abusing the Black woman in terms of a matriarchal society, or did it all begin with a patriarchal society? Did they simultaneously exist together in Africa? and there was no abuse, or
What
elaborate?
I can, it's impossible for anybody to say absolutely sure in time periods they never existed. But what we can say is there is no archaeological, no papyri, no pottery, no monuments, no stone figures, nothing. Not only that, no osteological. This is dealing with the bones, which I already went to on La Plata. La Plata is the only historical place they find damage to women's bones that is not related to direct war. And even in that, now you're bringing me to a whole nother thing, that even in that perspective, when we talk about prisoners of war, a lot of times in these regions, it was the women leading these armies. And especially when we go to the Candaces of Nubia. Okay. Now, we use the name Candace, but Candace actually means a queen ruler. And if you go to Nubia and Meroe, there were many women rulers, and you'll even find, I'm sure you can find it right now, if you type in Candaces of Nubia, they show queens, and she's voluptuous, she got curves and everything, and she's holding a sword above her head. And this is on a temple wall in Meroe. So what I'm saying is, there is no evidence or record. Whether they did it or not, how are we to know? We were not literally sitting there with the one man who smacked his wife one Tuesday in the year 9000 BC. You know what I'm saying? So I, as someone who stands on integrity and intelligence, I will never say something is absolute if I'm not physically there. But what I can say is it is absolutely not found in no record. And I'm always challenging people, if you can find pre-colonial, dynastic, or ancient record, I don't want nothing from the last 100 years. I don't want none from the last 200 years. I don't want none from the last 300, 400. I don't want none of that. If you cannot find me ancient record that talks about laws against, there's not even laws against women. Let's forget about the domestic violence. There's not even documented laws abusing or suppressing women. There's not even that. We don't find it in the negative confessions, in the 42 negative confessions. We don't find it in the 7 principles of Ma'at. We don't find it in, what's the other one? Ooh, I'm trying to go through all of, of course we don't find it in universal law, but that don't count. That's going beyond humans anyway. But when we look through our ancient principles and our records and our religions that we followed all the way down from Nubia, all the way up to, all the way up to Nubia, all the way down to Egypt, there's no record of a law saying no woman should do this. By the way, this leads me into a whole nother, and I love when y'all ask questions because all this crap starts flowing out of my subconscious. We could even go into the laws of Manu, M-A-N-U, type that in, the laws of Manu. And this was laws implemented by Assyrian invaders of India, meaning that anyone who was a Sudra, S-U-D-R-A, a Sudra, which is a black-skinned person, if a woman's eyes looked at food while it was being cooked, you had to throw out the food. The Sudra women were only allowed to travel at night because they were not to be seen. By the way, this is what gives birth to the untouchables, by the way, too. And we also got to remember, when we're always trying to pinpoint abuse of women, it's very challenging to do that because most of the time the abuse is coming from an invader to all the peoples, not just the women. So they were abusing the black children, the black men, and the black women. So when we look at the laws of Manu, which come under the Brahma aspect of the Assyrians, who the ancient Indish Kush Valley, settled by the Kushites, turned into India later, that they adopted from the Assyrians around 1500 to 1000 BC, we find that those laws were against black-skinned natives, both men and women. So I say that to say, when we keep trying to pinpoint only women being abused, I mean, I'm not saying this as a man, I'm saying this as a historian.
Right.
There is no pinpointing of just a woman getting her behind beat. There's prisoners of war, there's prisoners of captivity, and then even then, oh boy, I can go on forever. Even then, as a prisoner of war, you had the right You had the right to study yourself out of servitude. So you could be a prisoner of war if you follow the laws of Ma'at, and if you abide by the laws of that region, you could raise yourself out of servitude and be as close as a noble to a king. And you don't even have to be from the region. You don't even have to be black, and they allowed you to do this. I could even go into the Moors when they were ruling Europe at the time, and we could talk about what's called the Umayyad, Umayyad, the Umayyad dynasty, which is the most African dynasty of the Islamic Moors. When the Moors entered Europe around 710 AD, they allowed all the religions to be practiced. They did not do what Christians did and say, listen, you don't believe in Jesus? Die, mother. They didn't do that. When they came in there with their Islamic belief, they did not force their Islamic belief on anybody. If Christians wanted to stay Christian, they could stay Christian. If you wanted to stay Hebrew or Sephardim, the original term, Sephardim and all these things, you could stay that and you could practice amongst the people. That was the most peaceful time of Europe when African men ruled it. That was the most peaceful time for men. You even have European historians. One of them is Francis Champollion, or Francis Champollion, who is the one who is claimed to have deciphered the Medu Neter. He talks about how there is record of the Egyptians talking about the Tamahu being the most savage of races of the planet, and talking about how these groups of people was. So now let's fast forward to Herodotus. Let's go backwards to Herodotus, who's supposed to be the father of history. Yes. And let's go into the Arab historians that came into Africa during the time they were invaded. They thought, you know why they thought their foundation of our primitiveness? The foundation of them saying that we were primitive was the fact that our women roamed freely. This is documented. They said, oh my God, these people are nuts. They're letting their women just shop and control markets and roam all over the place. These people are crazy. So there is by far an abundance of evidence on the contrary to what is being adopted by our Black women today by cave feminist rhetoric nonsense. Because guess what? That is her fight, not yours. And it never was yours, by the way, never. I mean, for God's sake, how many monuments do we have that's the size of New York buildings dedicated to queens of kings? What kind of civilization that abuses women would build a monument the size? I mean, when we go to the Valley of the Kings, you have a whole set for queens. You have a whole, I mean, there's no comparison. The abundance is too crazy. It's just beyond. That's why it drives me crazy so much when I hear this nonsense that a lot of Black females, and I use that term specifically, are just regurgitating. They're just regurgitating it as if we did it. Let's go to slavery, because I already mentioned the Casual Killing Act, which was the white mistress beating the female slave to death, because usually that was the mulatto child of her husband, who was the master, or the lover of her husband, who was the master. So she was the one beating the hell out of these slaves, not the male. Not only that, they wasn't just raping you, they was raping me too.
That is correct.
I mean, we have what's called in the Caribbean islands, Jamaica and Haiti, we have what's called the buck breaking system, to where they would literally rape the men in front of their women and their children. Wow. So when we keep acting like abuse is exclusive to women, we are speaking from a purely European standard, because guess what? Well, even in Europe, they just, trust me, we can go into the Crusades, where they gave up their children. Oh Lord, the Crusades, their children tried to save them during the times of the war between the Arabs and the Europeans, or the Christians and the Muslims. When the fathers of these children were captured by the Arabs, the children went on the crusade to save their kin. You know what these parents did? They exchanged their children for their own life. Right. And this is well documented. They said, okay, listen, let us go and you can have our kids. That's what they did. And that's another, if you go into that same time period, this is why a delicacy at that time was child meat, child flesh. Yes. Cannibalism was rampant at this time. A lot of people don't like to talk about that, or they don't bring it up, but it was a delicacy to eat a baby. It was a delicacy. A lot of these parents during the crusade, these Christians that were fighting against these Islamic hordes who were winning, they would give their babies to them, and they would give their children to them. And a lot of the Gothic, we could even go before that into the Gothic
era, yes.
The Goths who destroyed Rome, and through that destruction, they actually ended up sacrificing their children to these Gothic kings who are nothing but Nordic savages. They had no literacy, no nothing. So they couldn't read the propaganda that said the Roman was the strongest empire to bring fear in them. So because they couldn't read the propaganda, the Roman was just another group of people that they were raping and pillaging. So when they sacked the Roman Empire, and by the way, this is how the Moors were invited into Europe, by the way. You could find this in not the Moors of Spain, because that's after the Moors fall. I gotta get I know the book in my head right now, but it's a very deep volume. There's 3 volumes to it, and they go into how King Roderick, who was one of the Gothic kings, and another king, he captured his daughter, and he took his daughter as a slave. So what the king did, that was the king of Southern Europe at that time, that king wrote to the Islamic army of Tariq. If you study who's the first general to enter Europe, it's Tariq, because he wrote to him as a form of savior to come and protect them from the Goths. This is documented history. So what we're saying is Europeans called on Black people to save them from their damn self.
So it's safe to say then, because the whole point of this discussion is to take the finger that has been pointed at our Black men as abusers, not that they have not become such. However, what Wada wanted to do, as well as myself, is to allow you as a man, particularly, African descent, to present and to represent the men. I know some women may be thinking, well, how can you have a man talk about domestic violence and abuse when they're the ones doing it? Well, I wanted to come as a major in art history from the Western perspective to show, to get our Black women out of regurgitating and immediately adopting these notions that we have been abused by our men since the antiquity of this illusionary thing called time.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to absolutely allow you as a male historian, so that if we have any men that are viewing this, to restore your integrity as Black men, to not allow this other form of being stereotyped, because this is another form of Western perspectives and all of these another shackle to be placed upon our men. And as the keeper of our civilization, as women, myself, Osa, Akamaye, it is our feminine responsibility and duty to help set this record straight when it comes to our men, and we are going to, in the second half of this, we're going to get into the timeline, and we're going to see or hear how our men, and as you heard him, our men have been, this is where domestic violence against men, ours. Now, we already know how that violence has been taking place upon men of other cultures within their own culture. However, we're talking about domestic violence against our men that was perpetrated upon our men in front of our eyes to terrify us as Black women, during the slave diaspora, to alter our minds You know, they have done everything possible to disfigure the integrity of our intimate connection as polarity. You spoke about polarity, Brother Mind, ascension, polarity, and gender and feminine energy, to disfigure this sacred complement between the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine as we should know it. So that was the reason why I asked that question. So I'm going to get off of it. And if anybody else has a question for Brother Mind, please present it.
I see Osa.
Yes, I do have a question. So,
Also,
Oh, wait. Osa, you I don't know.
oh, no, not again.
Yeah, you're very low. You're very low.
Can you hear me better?
There you go. There you
There
go.
we go. Okay, so so I know we still have the second half of the lecture. At some point, can we go in how the abuse of men has translated into the abuse of women in modern day, especially when we're talking about the African American community?
yes.
And
So sorry. When Queen Mother Nettie, Auntie Nettie was going, and I didn't want to interrupt her, but that's exactly what I was going to start touching on. You know why? Because I know, let's just be honest, I know that many of the women that tuned in for this particular topic did not tune in to maybe hear certain things outside of what they might have assumed this would be. So I definitely want to fast forward to that because while Queen Mother Net was speaking, she was bringing up good points that I definitely wanted to interject, but I did not want to be rude. Also remember, and after I make these points, I'm going to get exactly into what we're dealing with today. Also remember that during this time of slavery, which, by the way, they done made movies out of, they done documented, who was forced and trained to beat their women. The black slave was forced and trained, and not only that, it's given to us in a opposite fashion, because they like to call the man who beat the woman Uncle Tom, but it actually was the reverse. It was Sambo. It was Sambo who was one of the overseers who was forced to beat the woman. Uncle Tom was the one stepping in to try to take the beating for her, and he wasn't allowed to do that. So we got to take in consideration that not only have we been taught how to rape each other by far of slave breeding, because that's training for rape. When they put a bag over your head and they call you a mother effer because you're effing your mother because she's the only one on the plantation who is of birth age. Therefore, she needs to be breeded by the son who is the stud. We can go into the stud culture, which, by the way, doesn't even originate with Europe, because I can give y'all some real, it actually originates with the Moors, because the Moors understood the science of mixed breeding. And when they entered Europe, Europe was at such a low state of almost being declined in their population. Well, they actually instituted brothels of what was called stud Moors. And you can find this in a book called Moorish Whore. And there's a few books you can find this in. But basically, the Moor understood the science of creating the mulatto to extend the lifespan of the European. And so they would actually have very specific Moorish men who were known as studs, who would have sex with Scandinavian women and Slavic women, which where the term slave comes from anyway, Slavic. So they created brothels that were the opposite of what we see. Instead of a whole bunch of women naked walking around, it was black African men who were specific tools to impregnate white women and create a mulatto breed of Europeans to sustain their lifespan utilizing melanin. This is very well documented. The European took this knowledge, which I could do a whole thing on the Moors giving so much. They gave so much to these people that made these people, to be honest with you, and no offense, because all of us are technically Moors, all of us. But no offense to the Moors who practice what they practice today, but I am guaranteed, and I stand on my square, and I invite any more to challenge me. It is a guarantee that these white people would not be nowhere near in the power structure that they are if it was not for the Moors. So they took the science of breeding, of mixed breeding, and they distorted it to slave breeding. So then they took one of the youngest slaves whose penis could stay hard for any reason, and that was now called a stud. And he was rewarded for impregnating his sister, his mother, his aunt, his cousin, anybody that was on the plantation with a vagina and past the age of 13 of a birthing age. He was enforced to impregnate and rape her so they can breed. Remember, we were not considered human beings. So the same way as you breed cattle, horses, and all this, you're not worried about what the horse thinks about the other horse. You're not worried about what the cow thinks about the other cow. One got a penis, one got a vagina. That's all you need to know. You're going to put them together. And they will put bags over each other's heads a lot of the times. So, and this is where the term motherfucker comes from. That's why if you say that to a lot of white people, they get very offended because they know the truth. Black people, a lot of black people don't know the truth about that word. But I've been on work sites with Italians and Polish and stuff. If you say motherfucker, they get very offended because they know what that really means. So now let's fast forward, because even though I got so much more, okay, let me just get into one more thing. Let's talk about a time in Europe where there was a law called Prima Nocta, Primanocta. Now, there was many terms for this term that I'm bringing up, but the more traditional, more popular term is called the right of first night or obligation of lords. So basically, this was a law that any woman who was married on the land of a landlord, which is where we get the term today, landlord, any woman who was married on the land of any high nobleman in Europe, he had to have sex with her before the husband did on their wedding night. And that was a law. So we got to understand the mindset. So basically what I'm saying is, I make a law that if you choose to marry a woman, I have the right to rape her before you have sex with her. And they made movies about this. White people don't lie in their movies. Braveheart, if you get the movie Braveheart, the very beginning of Braveheart, the reason why he becomes so rebellious is because his wife gets murdered for fighting against her rapists. And so they killed her because technically by law, you can't resist that rape because it's a noble royal law. So if you fight against your rapist, they'll murder you as a woman, because to touch a nobleman is like touching a king. Let's get that out the way. Let's fast forward. Men today are beating on their black women. Excuse me. Males today are beating on their black women. Males today have adopted the mindset and the behavior of not only abuse of their women, but self-abuse of themselves. Now, we got to ask ourselves, is this some overnight thing? We already went into the historical aspect that it didn't exist in our pre-colonial or indigenous societies whatsoever by record. So this must be something that is a cause based on a form of social osmosis. When we look at men today, I like to go into the energy, because historically, historically, I would have to talk about Europeans if I was to do a contemporary historical, because Europeans actually had a sport where they would beat their wives and take pictures of their wives. And if their wife's face was unrecognizable by the way how bad they beat them, that European male won the game. Europeans used to auction off their wives. I got so much on this stuff, but I don't want to keep focusing on, because I know some of us want to hear about what's with these black men doing this shit to us. And I know that's what we really want to hear. The fact of the matter is, today, in these last 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, because even if we go into the integration, or excuse me, the segregation of Black families around America after 1865 emancipation, and we go to the so-called Black Wall Streets of America, the Rosewoods of America, the Haiti, type this in, Hayti. This was actually a black prosperous town in Florida. Now it was destroyed, and now that area is called Little Haiti. But it was a town called Haiti, not Haiti. And this town was a black flourishing town before integration, and they ran a highway through it. Now, I mention these towns to ask ourselves how much record of women beating was during these times in contemporary days. We are talking the early 1900s. We're talking 1920, 1930, 1940, 1950. How much do we remember our great-grandparents talking about the abuse of women during this time? I'm not saying it didn't exist. What I'm saying is, what was the capacity? What was the abundance? What was the numbers? Was it something that was common? Was it something that was accepted in our communities, that you could just beat on a woman and everything's cool? We know it really wasn't. And to be honest with you, when I look into the Black codes, and I look into the sundown codes, and I look into segregation, and I look into all these things implemented by white people on Black people to keep them out of certain areas. And then I look at the crime, because at one time, I was actually studying Black on Black crime exclusively, because when I would have certain lessons and present certain things, and I let everybody in, white people, I don't give a damn who you are, because I want it all. I want all the criticism. I want all the challenges. And one thing white people love to bring up is Black on Black crime, Black on Black crime. What about Black on Black crime? Here's the thing. When you go back to the 60s, 50s, and 40s, how much Black on Black crime did we have? When we go back to the Black neighborhoods who my mother grew up in, and I talk to her all the time about this, and my grandfather, who was a master mason, and my grandmother was an Eastern Star, and my mother was an Eastern Star. We had more property, we had more businesses, we had more so-called Black wealth than we have today. And when I say that, I'm not counting all of these LLCs and all of these Black businesses today that are under white rule. Those don't count. I'm talking about Black towns, cities, communities, and businesses that were rejected by white people. So they literally have to grow off the pure foundation of Blackness, the pure foundation of self-preservation, not off no social media, not off no white platform, not hiring a white ad company. They literally did everything from the pure basis of the foundation of their Black leadership and their Black preservation. By the way, the same way the Jews did, because we tend to forget that the Jews was ran out of every place they went. So eventually they said, you know what, F this. We are going to do for self, and we're going to rule the world. And guess where they're at now with their protocols of Zion? But that's another subject. Now, when we look into these Black towns going back 100 years, I personally don't find no record of wife abuse and wife beating. Am I saying it didn't exist? I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is there's no record of criminal behavior, and there's no real record of domestic abuse within these Black households. Now we also, if you notice, they're redefining abuse as well, just like they're redefining rape, they're redefining abuse, they're redefining sexuality, they're redefining gender, they're redefining everything for us. They got the nerve to walk around and call me, you, and everybody in this room a cis man and woman, a cis. These are terms that are being adopted by people who have no sense and that are placing it on us because we are heterosexual people. So now we're cisgender people. But anyway, I'm jumping ahead. When we look into these segregated societies, and anybody, please jump in, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't find a lot of spousal abuse in the 1920s and the 1930s during the Marcus Garvey movement, during Noble Drew Ali's movements. Noble Drew Ali came up in the 20s, man. Excuse me. Noble Drew Ali came up in the 1920s. Okay? Now, let's fast forward. Let's go to the 1960s of the civil rights movement, because this is the chronology we need to focus on. In the 1960s, during the time and the height of civil rights, the Black Panther Party, so on and so forth, if you look at the Black Panther Party, there was no discouragement, there was no argument against whose position was what. The women created the created the lunch care system for the children, which a lot of the white government like to pretend that they could, because you got to remember, white people didn't care if your children ate lunch in school. It was Black women that instituted the lunch programs. White people didn't care about that. But now today they want to take credit, act like lunch programs and stuff is their idea. Same thing with, by the way, not the welfare system, but the adoption agencies. Because we got to remember, a lot of our grandmothers and great-grandmothers adopted children in the neighborhood that lost their parents without no paperwork and no payments. And guess what that gave birth to? That gave birth to what we call foster care. Because every time our Black women or our Black men implement something for their own community, white people look at it and see the monetary benefits of it. And then they institute it in their own rulership and then their own dictatorship. And then they act like they invented it. Now, we look at the 1960s. We see our Black men in large majority with shotguns in front of Capitol buildings. We see our Black women in large majorities controlling the school programs, the lunch programs, becoming second and third mothers to these children. Now, what happens at this time to the Black men of these households in these areas? They become exiled, they become incarcerated, they become murdered, and then the first wave of heroin hits our community. Now, this is the very first notions and beginnings. Once again, I ask anybody, go to the 1950s and go to the 1960s and look at statistics of Black on Black crime. It's almost non-existent. And even when I actually have videos on my channel talking to because I have best friends who are elders. I've always been attracted to elders and always soaked and absorbed eldership. So I actually have a close brother named TJ. He's in his he's probably about 71, 72 now. And he talks to me about this stuff during when he was a child and how there was even the ghettos that we see today. The part of Brooklyn, I believe his projects was Brunswick projects, but the part of Brooklyn that was the projects that he was raised in was clean. And everybody had a 2-parent home. He told me how odd and how rare it was to see a child without a father in the house. And not only was it so rare, but the child who didn't have a father, they would lie about it. Oh, my dad is a truck driver. He's out of town. Oh no, my father died in the war. So any family that was abandoned, it was so rare that it was so shameful. So they would hide it. Now, we are still talking about the 50s and 60s. So what I'm doing is I'm setting up the context for the environment that we're speaking of when we talk about domestic violence. We're talking about majority 2-parent homes. Oh, I'm sorry. You want to? Yes.
Yes, brother Mind Ascension. As you go into this timeline, can you back up and deal with women's suffrage according to when it hit America became feminism? It became the women's rights movement, and that parlayed itself onto the civil rights, and now it's full blown into what is white feminism versus what is Black feminism, all coming from women's suffrage that had nothing to do with Black women again. So
yeah, that's what I was saying. There's no such thing as Black feminism.
Yeah, so would you
a new term?
Back up to that timeline.
Yes, I was actually getting into that after, because remember, the so-called feminist movement gained momentum when they adopted the black women who were so-called abandoned by their men during the time of civil rights. So I was actually getting to that chronology. I just wanted to start from segregation, because when we talk about abuse, we act like it's always been here, but I don't even have to go into ancient times, because when we go into the times of segregation, we don't even see it like that at times of segregation. So that's why I was working my way up to that, because the civil rights movement, just like they're doing today with LGBT, they merged it with the black women's abandonment of their black men due to exile, murder, and drug use. So if you look at oh God, what's her name again? Y'all know who I'm about to say. When you look at the CIA agent,
yes, that
who was a
admitted.
part, yes, who was a part of that movement, what she did was she adopted the black women of the civil rights struggle, and adopted those black women who had no men in their households to create a false sisterhood with white and black standing together. So that's what you're talking about, and that's what I was going to go into after the civil rights perspective. Now let's go back to the time frame of 1920, when women got the right to vote. But what women are we talking about? Because in 1920, did your black behind have the right to vote? No. So that clearly in itself, right then and there, lets you know that the women they're talking about, the women movement they're talking about, the feminism they're talking about, ain't got nothing to do with you, because you didn't get the right to vote until 25 years later in 1945. So don't tell me this white woman is your sister. Don't tell me this white woman knows your struggle. Don't tell me that you can adhere to her struggle, because guess what? She wasn't worried about you in 1920 when she was getting her right as a woman, and when they were administering rights to women, because guess what? At the time they were administering rights to women, you still wasn't a woman in their eyes. You still wasn't even a human in their eyes, because they didn't even think about you until 2 decades later. So let's not pretend we're on some equal playing field as women with other women in the world, or European women at that. Now, let's well, like you said, let's go into the aspect. Now, I set that foundation to set that before you have the flooding of heroin into our communities, before you had the exile of the leaders of many of these groups in civil rights movement, which is not just the Black Panthers, you had the Black Guerrilla Army, you had a lot of other different black organizations. The Black Panthers are just the most popular ones, but these men were exiled, incarcerated, and murdered at the highest numbers, leaving a lot of these women destitutes and single mothers at a time where single mother thing was not a proudful thing. That's another thing we need to get into, because today everybody's proud to be single. That shit never existed. Excuse my language. Nobody was proud to be a single mother. Nobody was proud to be raising children all by themselves and there's no man around. They wasn't walking around with pride with that until they adopted the feminist movement. And the feminist movement taught them that they didn't have to need a man. And this is where the wedlock thing came out of too, because during the time frame of the 50s and 60s and the 40s, if you saw a black woman pushing a stroller down the street, you immediately assumed she was married. There was no baby mama syndrome yet. You immediately assumed that was a married black woman, until the feminists came along and said, hey, you don't need no man to have a baby. You don't need a man to have a house. You don't need no man to have nothing, which, by the way, goes into doubling the tax bracket, making women work just as hard as men. But that's another story. Now, you were talking about the suffrage. Whose suffrage exactly? Because guess what? Who made the laws to not allow your black behind in a store? Black men? Who made the laws to say you can't work here or there? Black men? Who made the sundown laws? Who made the black code laws? Who made the laws that you have to drink over here and not over there? Who made all these laws that suppressed you in the first place? Black men? Black men had no power, just like you had no power. We were in the same box as you were at those times. Just as ridiculed, just as everything. So what suffrage are we talking about, and what suffrage at whose hands are we talking about? And never forget that this white woman let your suffrage and your segregation go on for 25 years before you were even included as a woman to have the right to vote. So once again, whose suffrage are we talking about? Emancipation of 1865. Where were we at this time? At this time, we had more families, we had more land, we had more than we have today. If not equal. And if you want any reference to this, you need to study, oh Lord, give me 1 second. I got him. You need to study, black labor